November 14, 1945. A small German bakery on the main street of Wolfville, Ontario. Inside the warm storefront filled with the scent of fresh rye bread and butter cookies, something unprecedented was happening. 23 German women prisoners of war, still wearing their faded gray auxiliary uniforms under borrowed Canadian winter coats, stood weeping uncontrollably. They weren't crying from fear or despair. They were crying because of bread. The loaves arranged on the wooden shelves before them were perfect specimens of Roggenbrot, the dense dark rye bread that every German child grew up eating. Beside them sat rows of Bauernbrot with their characteristic crossed scoring on top, and golden-plated Zopf loaves that German families served on Sunday mornings. These women had traveled across an ocean in the cargo hold of a military transport ship. They had been captured during the final chaotic months of the war in Europe, processed through military channels, and somehow ended up in a prisoner of war camp in rural Ontario rather than being sent home to their defeated country. They had endured months of uncertainty, cold, and the psychological weight of being enemy captives in a foreign land. But none of that had broken them. The bread broke them. 28-year-old Greta Klein reached out with a trembling hand to touch one of the dark rye loaves. Her fingers barely made contact with the crust before she pulled back, as if burned. The texture was exactly right. The slight give when pressed, the way the crust crackled under gentle pressure, the distinctive sour smell that rose from the bread. It was identical to the loaves her father had baked every morning in their family bakery in Garmisch-Partenkirchen. Behind the counter, Otto Müller, the 62-year-old German immigrant who owned the bakery, watched the scene unfold with his own eyes glistening. He had left Germany in 1938, one of the fortunate Jews who saw what was coming and managed to escape with his family before the borders closed. He had rebuilt his life in this quiet Canadian town, opening a bakery that served both the local population and the small German immigrant community. When the camp commander had approached him 3 days earlier with an unusual request to allow German prisoners to visit his establishment, Otto had spent 2 sleepless nights wrestling with the decision. These women had served the regime that murdered his relatives, destroyed his homeland, and turned his people into ashes. Yet watching them now, seeing the way the simple act of encountering familiar bread had stripped away all their military bearing and reduced them to homesick girls crying for something they thought they would never taste again, Otto felt something shift inside his chest. The Canadian guards who had escorted the women stood awkwardly near the door, uncertain how to respond to this display of raw emotion. Corporal James Henderson from Montreal had buzzed, expected resistance, defiance, or perhaps quiet resentment. He had not expected to see enemy soldiers weeping over bakery goods. One of the younger prisoners, a blonde girl who couldn't have been more than 20 years old, sank to her knees on the wooden floor, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Her hands covered her face, but tears streamed between her fingers. Beside her, an older woman with severe features, softened by grief, placed a gentle hand on the girl's shoulder and whispered something in German too quiet for anyone else to hear. The journey that brought these women to a Canadian bakery had begun 3 months earlier in the port of Southampton, England. August 1945, 3 months after victory in Europe, and the massive machinery of war was attempting to process millions of displaced people, refugees, and prisoners scattered across the shattered continent. Among them were 78 women who had served in various capacities for the German military. They were nurses, radio operators, administrative clerks, and logistics coordinators. Most were young, between 18 and 35 years old. None had fired weapons in combat, but all wore the gray uniforms that marked them as auxiliary members of the Wehrmacht. The British authorities processing them faced an unexpected problem. The prisoner of war camps in Britain were overflowing with male German soldiers awaiting repatriation. The women presented a logistical challenge. They couldn't be housed with male prisoners, and the few facilities equipped for women were already at capacity. Someone in the War Office made a decision that would alter these women's lives forever. They would be transferred to Canada, which had agreed to temporarily house overflow prisoners until transportation could be arranged to return them to Germany. The voyage across the Atlantic took 9 days aboard a converted cargo vessel. The women were housed below deck in compartments that had previously carried military equipment. The conditions were cramped but not deliberately harsh. They received adequate food, medical attention when needed, and were allowed on deck for fresh air twice daily under armed guard. Greta Klein spent most of the voyage writing in a small journal she had managed to keep hidden through multiple searches and transfers. Her entries from those days reveal a woman caught between past and future, uncertain which terrified her more. She wrote about her family's bakery, about the smell of rising dough that had filled her childhood mornings, about her father's hands covered in flour as he shaped loaves before dawn. She wrote about her younger brother Klaus, who had died on the Eastern Front, and her mother's last letter that had reached her in France just before her capture. That letter, now lost somewhere in the chaos of war, had contained news that their town had been bombed, the bakery destroyed, and her father was missing. Her mother was living with distant relatives, in Munich if she was still alive at all. Sitting beside Greta in the cramped hold was Frieda Schultz, a former Wehrmacht radio operator from Hamburg. At just 22 years old, Frieda had joined the Auxiliary Corps in 1943, believing the propaganda that told her she was defending her homeland from destruction. Now she stared at the metal walls of the ship and wondered what homeland remained. She had received no word from her family since January. Hamburg, she knew from whispered conversations among other prisoners, had been devastated by firebombing. The British guards assigned to watch over the women during the crossing were professional but distant. They had been instructed to maintain security while treating the prisoners according to Geneva Convention standards. Most of the guards were young men who had never seen combat, assigned to this duty after the war's end. They watched the German women with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion, uncertain how to reconcile the propaganda images of Nazi brutality with these ordinary-looking young women who seemed more frightened than dangerous. The train from Halifax to the interior of Ontario took 2 full days. The women pressed their faces against the windows, watching an endless landscape of forests and lakes roll past. This was a country of such vast emptiness that it seemed almost impossible. In Germany, every piece of land had been cultivated, built upon, fought over for centuries. Here, wilderness stretched for miles with no sign of human presence beyond the railway tracks. They arrived at the small station in Wolfville on a gray September morning. The town itself was barely visible from the platform, just a scattering of wooden buildings and a main street that looked like something from an American Western film. A military truck waited to transport them to the camp, which sat 5 miles outside town, surrounded by dense pine forest. The facility had originally been constructed to house German and Italian prisoners captured in North Africa and Europe earlier in the war. By late 1945, most male prisoners had been repatriated, leaving the camp partially empty. The women's section occupied the eastern portion of the compound, separated from the remaining male prisoners by high fences and constant guard supervision. Captain Thomas McGregor, the camp commander, was a veteran of the First World War who had spent the second conflict in administrative roles far from combat. He was a practical man who ran his facility by the book, treating prisoners with correctness rather than either cruelty or particular kindness. He addressed the new arrivals in accented German, reading from prepared remarks about camp rules, daily schedules, and expected behavior. The women would be housed in wooden barracks, 4 long buildings that could accommodate 20 women each. They would work in the camp kitchen, laundry, and garden, receiving wages according to Geneva Convention. Requirements: mail would be processed through the Red Cross. Medical care would be provided. Escape attempts would be punished severely. Religious services would be available. Questions could be submitted in writing to the camp administration. As Captain McGregor spoke, Greta studied her surroundings. The camp was clean, well-maintained, and surrounded by barbed wire fences that seemed almost decorative compared to the formidable barriers she had seen at other facilities. Guard towers stood at each corner, but the soldiers manning them looked more bored than vigilant. The Canadian flag snapped in the wind above the administration building, its red maple leaf strange and foreign to eyes accustomed to different symbols. The barracks were Spartan, but adequate. Each woman received a narrow bed with clean sheets, a small footlocker for personal possessions, and space on communal shelves for any additional items. The buildings were heated by wood stoves, and the women quickly learned they would need to master the art of keeping fires going through the brutal Canadian winter that the guards warned them was coming. That first night, lying in an unfamiliar bed in an unfamiliar country, thousands of miles from everything she had known, Greta listened to the sound of women crying quietly in the darkness. Some wept for homes destroyed, families lost, or futures erased. Others cried from simple exhaustion and fear. Greta remained dry-eyed, her tears having been spent somewhere over the Atlantic Ocean. She had entered a strange numbness where emotion seemed like a luxury she could no longer afford. Greta's father had woken at 3 o'clock every morning for 40 years. She used to hear him moving through the house in the darkness, his footsteps careful on the wooden stairs as he descended to the bakery below their living quarters. By 3:30 the ovens would be heating, and by 4 o'clock the first loaves would be rising on the wooden boards that lined the work tables. The smell would drift up through the floorboards, penetrating even into dreams. Warm yeast, toasting grain, and something else that Greta could never quite name, but which meant home more powerfully than any other sensation. She had grown up in that bakery, learning to shape dough before she could properly read. Her father, Joseph Klein, was a master baker who had learned the trade from his own father. The recipes they used had been refined over 3 generations, each loaf a connection to ancestors who had fed their community through wars, depressions, and disasters. Roggenbrot was their specialty, the dense, dark rye bread that Bavarian families considered essential to any proper meal. Joseph could judge the exact moment when dough had risen enough by touch alone, his flour-dusted fingers pressing gently into the mass to test its resistance. Too little rise and the bread would be dense and heavy. Too much, and it would collapse in the oven, creating an uneven crumb. Greta had been his apprentice and his pride. While her brother Klaus was expected to eventually take over the business, she was the one who showed real aptitude for the craft. She understood instinctively the relationship between ingredients, how humidity affected flour absorption, how the wood-fired ovens created pockets of different temperatures that required constant attention. By the time she was 16, she could manage the morning baking routine almost as well as her father. Those early morning hours in the bakery had been sacred time. Father and daughter worked side by side in comfortable silence, communicating through small gestures and the shared rhythm of familiar tasks. Knead the dough, shape the loaves, load the ovens, monitor the baking, remove at precisely the right moment when the crust had achieved that perfect, deep brown color. The sound of crust crackling as loaves cooled was like quiet conversation in a language only bakers understood. Customers began arriving at 6 o'clock, forming a line outside the shop that Joseph took as the highest compliment to his craft. Herr Zimmermann, who ran the butcher shop, always purchased 4 loaves of Roggenbrot every other day. Frau Weber from the hotel needed 2 dozen rolls each morning. The priest from St. Martin's Church bought Bauernbrot for church functions. Each customer had preferences that Joseph remembered without needing to write them down. The bakery had been more than a business. It was the heartbeat of their small community, a place where people gathered to exchange news, share concerns, and maintain the social fabric that held a town together. Greta's mother managed the front counter, greeting customers with genuine warmth while deftly handling money and wrapping purchases in brown paper tied with string. This was the world Greta had expected to inherit, the life she had been preparing for since childhood. Then came 1939, and everything changed. Klaus received his conscription notice first. Their mother wept, but their father said nothing, his jaw tight as he kneaded dough with more force than necessary. The Canadian Guards were different from what the German women had expected. They were neither cruel nor particularly kind. They simply did their jobs with a quiet efficiency that left the prisoners uncertain how to interpret their captors' intentions. There was no shouting, no deliberate humiliation, no theatrical displays of authority. The guards gave orders in calm voices, expected compliance, and mostly left the women alone to manage their daily routines. This absence of drama was somehow more unsettling than hostility would have been. Sergeant William Fraser, the senior guard assigned to the women's section, was a farmer's son from Saskatchewan who had spent the war years in administrative roles. At 43 years old, he was too old for combat duty, but had served his country by managing logistics and prisoner facilities. He spoke no German and made no effort to learn. He communicated through gestures, simple English phrases repeated slowly, and a translator when necessary. His face remained neutral regardless of circumstances, neither friendly nor hostile, just professionally blank. The younger guards followed his example. Corporal James Henderson, Corporal Robert Dumont from Quebec, and Private Thomas Chen, whose parents had immigrated from China 20 years earlier, all maintained the same careful distance. They supervised work details, conducted routine inspections, and ensured security protocols were followed, but they never engaged in conversation beyond what was necessary for their duties. The women worked in silence, ate in silence, and returned to their barracks in silence. The only voices they heard were their own, speaking German in hushed tones after lights out. Greta found the quietness oppressive in ways that active hostility might not have been. At least hostility gave you something to resist against, something to define yourself in, opposition to. This Canadian politeness that kept them at arm's length left her feeling invisible, erased from significance. They were problems to be managed rather than enemies to be defeated or fellow human beings to be engaged with. The work assigned to them was neither difficult nor particularly meaningful. Kitchen duty meant peeling vegetables, washing dishes, and basic food preparation under the supervision of the camp cook. Laundry duty involved scrubbing uniforms and linens in large basins, then hanging everything to dry on lines stretched between posts. Garden duty had been the most pleasant task during September and early October, tending the vegetable plots that supplied fresh produce for the camp. But as November arrived and frost killed the last plants, there was little left to do besides prepare the ground for winter. The women moved through their assigned tasks mechanically, their minds elsewhere. Frida Schultz, working beside Greta in the kitchen, whispered once, afternoon, that she felt like a ghost haunting her own life. Everything seemed distant and unreal, as if they were watching themselves from outside their own bodies. Time passed without meaning, days blending together in gray sameness. The first real snowfall arrived on October 28th, earlier than usual according to the Canadian Guards. The women woke to find their world transformed into something from a fairy tale, white powder covering everything in soft silence. Most had never seen snow like this. Even in Bavaria, winters were mild compared to what the Canadians casually referred to as autumn weather. By mid-November, temperatures regularly dropped below freezing, and the women learned quickly that their issued clothing was inadequate for the climate they now inhabited. The camp administration responded with bureaucratic slowness, requisitioning proper winter coats through official channels that seemed designed to move at glacial speed. In the meantime, the women shivered through morning roll calls, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. It was during this period that small gestures began appearing, gestures that confused the prisoners precisely because they came without explanation or acknowledgement. Greta discovered an extra blanket folded at the foot of her bed one morning. It was thick wool, clearly military issue, and definitely not part of the standard allocation for prisoners. She looked around the barracks questioningly, but no one claimed responsibility for placing it there. Over the following days, other women reported similar mysterious appearances: a pair of warm socks, a knitted scarf, a second undershirt. Private Thomas Chen was observed carrying boxes into the women's section, but when asked directly about the source of these items, he simply shrugged and continued his work. Sergeant Fraser maintained his characteristic neutrality, neither confirming nor denying any knowledge of where these extra supplies originated. The women speculated among themselves in whispered German conversations. Were the guards taking pity on them? Were these items surplus that would otherwise go to waste? Or was this some kind of test to see if they would become dependent on Canadian charity? Frida suggested that perhaps the guards were simply decent people who saw other human beings suffering from cold and responded in the only way their positions allowed. Greta was less certain. She had been taught not to trust enemy kindness, that such gestures always came with ulterior motives. Yet the blanket on her bed remained, and she used it every night as temperatures continued to drop. The kitchen became the warmest place in the camp, and Corporal Henderson began allowing the women assigned to kitchen duty to arrive 15 minutes early and stay 15 minutes late, ostensibly to complete their work more thoroughly. Everyone understood this was actually to give them extra time in the heated space. He never acknowledged this arrangement directly, never sought gratitude or recognition. He simply adjusted the schedule and said nothing about it. One particularly brutal morning, when ice had formed inside the barracks windows overnight, Sergeant Fraser made an announcement through the translator. The women would be issued proper winter coats within 2 weeks, but until then, work details would be shortened and conducted in rotating shifts to minimize exposure. This practical adjustment saved them from hours of suffering, yet Fraser delivered the news in the same flat tone he used for everything else. Corporal James Henderson made his weekly supply run to Wolfville on November 7th, driving the camp truck down the rutted road through forests already heavy with snow. The town was quiet on weekday mornings, just a few shoppers moving between the general store, the post office, and the handful of other businesses that lined Main Street. Henderson parked in front of Morrison's general store, his usual first stop, and began loading supplies. He was securing boxes in the truck bed when he noticed something he had somehow missed during previous trips. Across the street between the hardware store and a small insurance office stood a bakery with a hand-painted sign above the door, Muller's Bäckerei. The German word was written in old-fashioned script, and even Henderson, with his limited education, could recognize it as foreign. He stood staring at the storefront, his mind working through implications. A German bakery in a small Canadian town, operating openly during wartime. It seemed impossible, yet there it was. He finished loading his supplies, then crossed the street and pushed open the bakery door. A small bell chimed above his head. The interior was warm and filled with the smell of fresh bread that made his stomach growl, despite having eaten breakfast just 2 hours earlier. Behind the counter stood an elderly man with a neat gray beard and tired eyes that suggested he had seen more of life than he had wanted. Otto Muller looked at the uniformed soldier with the wariness of someone who had learned to be careful around men with authority. Henderson removed his cap and tried to arrange his features into something friendly rather than official. He purchased 2 loaves of dark rye bread, making small talk about the weather and the early snow. Otto responded politely but cautiously, his English excellent but colored by an accent that confirmed his origins. As Henderson was leaving, he paused at the door. "That's fine bread you make. My grandmother was German, came over in 1898. She used to bake bread that smelled like this." Otto's expression softened slightly. "Thank you. Old recipes, traditional methods. These things should not be forgotten, even when other things change." Henderson drove back to the camp with his mind turning over possibilities. That evening, he mentioned the bakery to Sergeant Fraser during their routine briefing. Fraser listened, without comment, his face revealing nothing. But 2 days later, Fraser himself made the trip to town and returned with bread from Mueller's bakery. He placed one loaf in the guard's mess and delivered the other to Captain McGregor's office without explanation. The camp commander examined the bread curiously. "Where did this come from?" "Town bakery, sir. German baker, been there since before the war." McGregor cut a slice, tasted it thoughtfully, and spent the next hour staring out his window at the compound where German women prisoners moved through their morning routines. Otto Mueller had arrived in Canada in March 1939, one of the last Jews to escape Germany before the borders closed completely. He came with his wife Rachel, their daughter Sarah, who was then 15 years old, and whatever possessions they could carry in 3 suitcases. Everything else, the bakery his family had operated in Frankfurt for 4 generations, their home, their savings beyond what they could smuggle out, was left behind to be confiscated by a regime that had declared them unwelcome in the land of their birth. The journey to Canada had been arranged through distant cousins who had immigrated decades earlier and established themselves in Toronto. These relatives provided sponsorship papers and a small loan to help the Muellers start over. Otto had chosen Wolfville specifically because it was far from major cities, a place where he hoped to rebuild quietly without drawing attention. The town needed a bakery. The previous baker had died the year before, leaving residents dependent on bread shipped from larger towns or their own amateur efforts. Otto rented a small storefront on Main Street and converted the back room into a working bakery. He purchased a used oven, built work tables from lumber, and slowly assembled the tools of his trade. The first months were difficult. Local residents were suspicious of foreigners, especially Germans, as war tensions increased in Europe. But bread has a way of overcoming prejudice. Otto's loaves were simply better than anything available for 50 miles. His rye bread had the perfect balance of sour tang and subtle sweetness. His rolls emerged from the oven with crusts that shattered at the slightest pressure, revealing soft interiors that absorbed butter like a blessing. Gradually, Otto became an accepted part of Wolfville's small community. When war was declared in September 1939, there were some uncomfortable moments. A few customers stopped coming, unwilling to buy from anyone with German origins, regardless of the circumstances that had brought him to Canada. But most residents distinguished between a Jewish refugee who had fled the Nazis and the Nazi regime itself. The mayor himself made a point of buying bread from Mueller's bakery every week, a small gesture that signaled official approval. Otto never spoke about what he had left behind unless directly asked. His wife Rachel was even more silent about the past. Their daughter Sarah attended the local school, worked hard to lose her German accent, and tried to become as Canadian as possible, as quickly as possible. At night, Otto lay awake wondering about relatives who had not escaped. His brother Samuel, who had insisted the troubles would pass. His elderly parents, who were too frail to attempt the journey. Cousins, aunts, uncles, friends from childhood. Letters had stopped coming in 1941. Since then, silence. He baked bread in the darkness of early morning, and sometimes the rhythm of kneading dough was the only thing that kept memories at bay. The work was meditation and medicine both, his hands performing tasks they had learned in childhood, connecting him to his father and grandfather, even as continents and catastrophe separated them. When Captain McGregor appeared in his bakery in November 1945, asking questions about whether Otto would be willing to allow German prisoners to visit. His establishment, Otto's first instinct was to refuse absolutely. Captain McGregor sat in Otto Mueller's bakery after closing time, 2 cups of weak coffee between them on the small table usually reserved for customers. The captain had chosen to approach this conversation personally rather than sending a subordinate, recognizing that what he was asking required delicate handling. He explained the situation carefully. The German women prisoners at his camp were becoming increasingly despondent as winter closed in. They received no news from home, had no idea if their families had survived the war, and faced an uncertain future. Morale was deteriorating in ways that concerned him from both humanitarian and practical standpoints. Depression led to illness, and illness created complications he preferred to avoid. He had been considering ways to improve their mental state when Sergeant Fraser mentioned the German bakery in town. Perhaps, McGregor suggested, allowing the women to visit. Muller's establishment once a week under strict supervision might provide them with a small connection to their culture, something to look forward to that might lift their spirits. Otto listened with his face growing increasingly troubled. He set down his coffee cup with careful precision, buying himself a moment to formulate his response. "Captain, I understand your concern for these women, but you must understand my position. My family fled Germany because of what that regime did to us. My brother, my parents, they did not escape. I have received no word from them since 1941. I believe they are dead, murdered by the government these women served." McGregor nodded slowly. "I understand, Mr. Mueller. Believe me, I debated whether to even make this request. But these women, most of them are very young. They were clerks, nurses, radio operators. They never made policy decisions or committed atrocities. They were caught up in something larger than themselves." Otto's expression hardened. We were all caught up in something larger than ourselves. The question is what choices we made within those circumstances. I chose to leave everything I knew to protect my family. What choices did these women make? The conversation continued for nearly an hour. McGregor did not pressure or plead. He simply presented the situation and allowed Otto to wrestle with it. He mentioned that some of the women had been writing desperate letters to the Red Cross, trying to locate family members. Most received no responses. The silence from Germany was its own kind of torture, leaving them suspended between hope and despair. He described how the women moved through their daily routines like automatons, performing tasks mechanically while their minds seemed elsewhere. He had seen this before in other prisoners, this particular type of psychological deterioration that came from having no connection to their former lives and no clear path to future ones. Otto finally spoke. "If I agree to this, and I have not decided that I will, I need time to discuss it with my wife. Rachel's family also remained in Germany. This decision affects her as much as me." McGregor stood to leave. "Take whatever time you need, Mr. Mueller. I won't pursue this if you're uncomfortable." Otto watched the captain walk out into the November darkness. He locked the bakery door and climbed the stairs to the apartment above where Rachel was reading by lamplight. Rachel Mueller surprised her husband by supporting the idea after 2 days of painful discussion. Her reasoning was simple but profound. If we allow hatred to make our decisions, then Hitler wins even after his death. We must be better than what was done to us. Otto wrestled with this logic but ultimately could not argue against it. On November 13th, he sent word to Captain McGregor that he would allow the women to visit his bakery, but under strict conditions. No more than 25 at a time, visits limited to 1 hour, and armed guards must remain present throughout. McGregor agreed to all terms. The first group would visit on November 14th. Greta Klein was among the women selected for that initial visit. The announcement had come during morning roll call, delivered by Sergeant Fraser through the translator. 25 names were called. Those women would be transported to town the following day for a supervised excursion. No explanation was given about their destination. The selected prisoners spent the evening speculating. Perhaps they were being transferred to another facility. Perhaps there was paperwork to process. Perhaps this was some kind of test or evaluation. The next morning, they were loaded into a covered truck normally used for supply runs. The canvas sides blocked their view of the landscape, leaving them to imagine their destination as the vehicle bumped along rough roads. When the truck finally stopped and the guards opened the back, the women climbed down to find themselves on a small town's main street. It was the first time any of them had been outside the camp since their arrival 2 months earlier. The November air was crisp and clean, carrying smells of wood smoke and distant pine forests. A few local residents stopped on the sidewalk to stare at the unusual sight of German prisoners being escorted through their town. Corporal Henderson led them toward a storefront with a painted sign. As they got closer, Frieda Schultz was the first to recognize the German word, Bäckerei. She grabbed Greta's arm, her voice barely a whisper. "It's a bakery, a German bakery." The women filed inside, crowding into the small space that suddenly seemed far too tiny to contain 25 people plus guards. Otto Muller stood behind his counter, his expression carefully neutral. He had prepared for this moment by baking throughout the night, filling his shelves with every traditional bread and pastry he could produce. Roggenbrot, Bauernbrot, Pumpernickel, Stollen, Lebkuchen, butter cookies shaped like stars. The women stood frozen, staring at the display. For a long moment no one moved or spoke. Then Anna Fischer, a 19-year-old former file clerk from Cologne, made a small sound in the back of her throat. It started as a whimper, but grew into a sob. She covered her mouth with both hands, but tears streamed down her face. The emotional dam broke. Women began weeping openly, some quietly with tears running down their cheeks, others with full-body sobs that shook their shoulders. Greta reached out to touch a loaf of Roggenbrot, and the moment her fingers made contact with the crust, she was transported back to her father's bakery. Otto Müller had not anticipated the intensity of the women's reaction. He stood behind his counter watching German soldiers cry over his bread, and something inside his carefully maintained emotional distance began to crack. These were not the faceless representatives of the regime that had destroyed his life. They were young women, far from home, confronting the physical evidence of everything they had lost. He cleared his throat, his voice rough when he finally spoke in German for the first time since opening his Canadian bakery. "Please, sit. I have made coffee." There are only 4 small tables in the bakery, but the women crowded around them while others stood along the walls. Otto and Rachel, who had been waiting in the back room, brought out cups of weak coffee and began cutting bread into slices. They placed pieces on small plates and set them on the tables within reach. Greta picked up a slice of Roggenbrot with trembling hands. She brought it to her nose first, inhaling the distinctive sour smell that was so familiar it hurt. Then she bit into it. The texture was perfect, dense but not heavy, with a slight moisture that spoke of proper fermentation. The taste exploded across her tongue, not just the physical flavor of rye and caraway seeds, but the taste of her father's bakery. At dawn, of her mother wrapping loaves in brown paper, of her brother Klaus stealing warm rolls fresh from the oven. She was suddenly 7 years old again, standing on a wooden stool beside her father as he taught her to score dough before baking. She was 12, making her first unsupervised batch, while her father watched with quiet pride. She was 16, working side by side with him in comfortable silence. The bread tasted like everything she would never have again. Her family, her home, her identity, her future, all of it compressed into this single slice of dark rye bread baked by a stranger in a foreign country. She bent forward, her face nearly touching the table, and wept. Around her, other women were having similar experiences. Frieda held a piece of Bauernbrot and whispered the Lord's Prayer in German, something she had not done since childhood. Anna Fischer ate slowly, methodically, as if trying to make each bite last forever. Margareta Schmidt, a former nurse from Stuttgart, sat with her hands folded in her lap, staring at the bread on her plate without touching it. She finally spoke, her voice barely audible. "My grandmother baked bread like this every Sunday. She died in 1943 during a bombing raid. I never got to say goodbye." Otto moved between the tables, refilling coffee cups, his movements mechanical as he processed the scene unfolding in his bakery. Rachel stood near the door, tears streaming down her own face as she watched these women mourn through bread. The Canadian guards maintained their positions, but their rigid military postures had softened. Even Sergeant Fraser, who prided himself on professional detachment, found himself looking away from the raw emotion filling the small space. Corporal Henderson stared at his boots, his jaw working as he struggled with feelings he had not expected to encounter during what he thought would be a routine security detail. After the women were escorted back to their truck, Otto and Rachel cleaned the bakery in silence. Coffee cups were washed and dried, crumbs swept from tables, chairs straightened. Rachel finally spoke as she wiped down the counter. That was harder than I expected. Otto nodded, unable to find words for what he was feeling. He had prepared himself to face women who represented everything he had fled. Instead, he had encountered human beings whose grief mirrored his own. They mourned lost families just as he mourned his. They wept for destroyed homes just as he had wept. The symmetry was uncomfortable, challenging the clear moral categories he had constructed to make sense of his experiences. That night, Otto dreamed of his brother Samuel for the first time in months. In the dream, they were boys again, working in their father's Frankfurt bakery. Samuel was laughing about something, his hands deep in dough, flour dusting his dark hair. Otto woke with tears on his face and Rachel's hand on his shoulder. The second visit happened 1 week later with a different group of 25 women. Otto baked the same assortment of traditional breads and pastries. The emotional response was equally intense, though he was slightly more prepared for it this time. He found himself studying individual faces, noticing details. This one had her mother's eyes. That one carried herself like his cousin Ruth. Another laughed through tears in a way that reminded him of his daughter Sarah at a younger age. They were becoming individuals rather than a collective symbol. One woman approached him directly, speaking careful German. "Mein Name ist Greta Klein. My father was a baker in Garmisch. Your Roggenbrot is exactly like his." Otto felt something twist in his chest. "What was your father's name?" "Joseph Klein. He learned from his father, who learned from his. 3 generations of bakers." Otto remembered meeting a Joseph Klein at a baking conference in Munich in 1936, a quiet man with clever hands and strong opinions about fermentation times. Could it be the same person? The world suddenly felt smaller and more complicated. Over the following weeks, the visits became routine. Every Wednesday, 25 women would be brought to the bakery for an hour. Otto began to learn their names, their stories. Frida, whose family in Hamburg was confirmed dead. Anna, whose parents might still be alive in Bavaria. Margaret, who had nightmares about the wounded soldiers she had failed to save. Each woman carried her own burden of loss and guilt and confusion about who she was now that the world she had known no longer existed. Otto found himself talking to them, at first just brief exchanges, then longer conversations. He told them about his own journey to Canada, about learning to bake in a new country with unfamiliar ingredients. He did not tell them about the relatives he had lost, not yet, but the knowledge hung between them like smoke. By December, the weekly bakery visits had transformed into something none of the participants had anticipated. What began as a humanitarian gesture to improve prisoner morale had evolved into a strange form of community. Otto started teaching the women about bread making, explaining the chemistry of fermentation, the importance of temperature control, the way different grains produced different textures. He demonstrated shaping techniques, showed them how to score dough for optimal expansion during baking. Several women, including Greta, revealed their own baking knowledge. She corrected his technique for braiding challah, showing him a method her father had taught her that produced tighter, more even plaits. Frida knew songs that bakers traditionally sang while kneading, rhythmic chants that helped maintain the proper tempo. Anna contributed family recipes her grandmother had passed down. The bakery became a space where German culture could exist without the contamination of Nazi ideology, where traditions could be honored separate from the regime that had tried to claim ownership of them. The Canadian Guards began to relax their vigilant postures. Corporal Henderson even asked Otto to teach him basic bread making, explaining that his wife back in Montreal had always wanted to learn proper techniques. Sergeant Fraser, while maintaining his characteristic reserve, started arriving 15 minutes early to each visit, ostensibly to check security arrangements, actually to drink coffee and eat whatever Otto had fresh from the oven. The local community's response was mixed, but gradually warming. Some residents remained uncomfortable with German prisoners freely walking their main street. Others, particularly those who knew Otto's story, saw the visits as evidence of Canada's superior values. Mrs. Catherine Mills, who taught at the local school, began visiting the bakery on Wednesday mornings to observe the interactions. She later wrote an article for the regional newspaper describing what she witnessed. Not revenge, not punishment, but the difficult work of finding humanity in former enemies. Her article sparked debate across Ontario about appropriate treatment of prisoners of war. The women themselves began to change in visible ways. They stood straighter, spoke more freely, showed animation during conversations that had been absent during their first months in Canada. The weekly bakery visit gave them something to anticipate, a break in the monotony that proved there was still beauty and meaning available in the world. Greta started keeping detailed notes about Otto's techniques, recording recipes and methods, with the precision of someone planning for a future that extended beyond captivity. She wrote in her journal that the bakery had given her something she thought she had lost forever. Not just connection to her past, but the possibility of carrying her father's legacy forward, even if she never saw him again. During one visit, Otto asked the women about their plans for after repatriation. The question created uncomfortable silence. Finally, Frida spoke what many were thinking. What do we return to? My family is dead, my city is rubble. Germany is occupied territory divided between victors. We served a regime that committed atrocities we claim we did not know about, though perhaps we should have known. The Red Cross letters began arriving in mid-December, trickling in through international mail systems, slowly recovering from wartime disruption. Each envelope represented months of searching through displaced persons records, survivor lists, and refugee camp registries. For the German women prisoners, these letters were both desperately wanted and terribly feared. They would finally provide answers to questions that had haunted them since capture, but the answers might be worse than uncertainty. Greta received her letter on December 18th. Captain McGregor called her to his office and handed her the thin envelope with Red Cross markings. She held it for a long moment before opening it, aware that her life might fundamentally change based on whatever words waited inside. The letter was brief, typed in German on official letterhead. Her mother was alive, living in a displaced persons camp outside Munich. Her father, Josef Klein, was listed as missing, last seen during the Allied bombing of Garmisch in April 1945. No body had been recovered, no death certificate issued, just the terrible word missing that meant nothing and everything simultaneously. Greta read the letter 3 times, then folded it carefully and placed it in her uniform pocket. She thanked Captain McGregor in a voice that sounded distant to her own ears and walked back to the barracks. Only when she was alone did she allow herself to feel the full weight of what she had learned. Her father was probably dead, his body buried under rubble of the bakery he had built. Her mother was alive but homeless, dependent on international charity, living among strangers. The home Greta had spent months dreaming of, returning to, no longer existed in any meaningful sense. Other women received similar news throughout December. Anna Fisher learned that both parents had died during the firebombing of Cologne. Frida's entire family was confirmed dead. Margaret discovered her husband had been killed on the Eastern Front, and her young son was living with distant relatives who could barely feed themselves. Letter after letter brought variations of the same story: destruction, loss, displacement, and uncertainty. Some women received no letters at all, which in many ways was worse than bad news. At least bad news provided closure. Silence left them suspended in permanent limbo, unable to mourn or hope with any confidence. The emotional toll was visible throughout the camp. Women who had begun showing signs of recovery slipped back into depression. Meal times became quieter. Work details were performed mechanically. Even the weekly bakery visits lost some of their restorative power as women confronted the reality that they were not temporarily displaced from homes they would eventually return to. They were permanently severed from a past that no longer existed. Otto noticed the change immediately during the next bakery visit. The women were present physically, but seemed absent spiritually, going through motions without engagement. He tried to draw them into conversation, but received only brief responses. Finally, he set down the bread knife he had been using and addressed them directly. "I know many of you have received difficult news from Germany. I see it in your faces." Captain McGregor received orders from Ottawa in early January 1946 regarding repatriation procedures for German prisoners. The directive was clear: all prisoners were to be returned to Europe by March, transported to displaced persons processing centers in the Allied occupation zones, then released to make their own way in whatever remained of their country. The news hit the women's camp like a physical blow. March was less than 3 months away. The date that had once seemed impossibly distant was suddenly imminent, forcing decisions they had been avoiding through months of uncertainty. Greta sat on her bunk that evening with her mother's letter in her hands, reading it for perhaps the 100th time. Her mother was alive but living in a camp, dependent on Allied food supplies, with no permanent housing or income. If Greta returned, what could she offer besides becoming another mouth to feed in a country with nothing to spare? Her father was almost certainly dead. The bakery was rubble. Garmisch was occupied territory. What exactly would she be returning to? Frida expressed similar thoughts during their whispered conversations after lights out. "I have no family, no home, no possessions beyond this uniform. If I return to Hamburg, I will be alone in a destroyed city with no skills except radio operation for a military that no longer exists. How do I survive that?" Other women faced different calculations but equally difficult choices. Those with surviving family members felt obligation pulling them toward repatriation despite their fears. Those with confirmed losses saw only devastation waiting across the ocean. The Wednesday bakery visit in mid-January became an unexpected forum for discussing these dilemmas. Otto, learning of the March deadline, asked the women directly what they wanted to do. The question opened floodgates. Anna Fisher spoke first. "I want to stay in Canada. I know that is probably impossible, that we are prisoners with no rights to make such requests. But my family is dead. Germany destroyed itself and took my loved ones with it. Why should I return to mourn among ruins when I could build something new here?" Several other women nodded agreement. Margaret countered with the opposing view. "My son is in Germany. He is 7 years old and living with my husband's sister, who resents having to care for him. Whatever horrors wait there, he is there. How can I choose comfort over my own child?" The discussion continued for the full hour, with women arguing both sides. Otto listened carefully, then shared his own experience. "When I left Germany in 1939, I felt I was abandoning everything important. My parents, my brother, my business, my identity as a German. I thought I was running away like a coward. But I learned something in Canada. You cannot build a life on ruins. You can only build on solid ground wherever you find it. If Germany is ruins for you, perhaps solid ground is here." His words sparked intense debate that continued long after the women returned to camp. That night, Greta began writing a letter to Captain McGregor. She worked on it for 3 days, crossing out sentences and starting over, trying to find words for a request she knew was unprecedented and probably impossible. Greta's letter to Captain McGregor was delivered on January 21st. In it, she formally requested permission to remain in Canada after the war, citing the death of her father, her mother's inability to provide housing or support, and her desire to continue the baking tradition she had learned as a child. She acknowledged that such a request was highly unusual and probably impossible, but she felt compelled to ask regardless. She was not alone in making this request. Over the following week, 7 other women submitted similar letters. Anna Fisher, Frieda Schultz, Margareta Schmidt, who had agonized over abandoning her son but ultimately decided she could help him more by establishing herself in Canada and sending money, and 4 others whose families were confirmed dead or whose situations in Germany offered no realistic path forward. Captain McGregor forwarded these requests to his superiors in Ottawa with his own recommendation for approval, noting that the women had been model prisoners and that their integration into Canadian society appeared feasible given local support. The bureaucratic response was slow and non-committal. Immigration policy for former enemy nationals was still being formulated. No clear precedent existed for prisoners of war requesting to remain in the country that had held them captive. While Ottawa deliberated, Otto Muller made his own decision. During the first Wednesday visit in February, he asked Greta to stay after the other women had been loaded into the truck for return to camp. Corporal Henderson agreed to give them 10 minutes, standing discreetly near the door while Otto and Greta spoke in German. "I have been thinking about your situation," Otto began. "If you are allowed to stay in Canada, you will need employment and housing. I am getting old. The work of running a bakery at my age is becoming difficult. I could use an assistant who understands the craft, someone who could eventually take over the business when I can no longer manage it." He paused, gauging her reaction. "I am offering you a position if immigration authorities approve your request. You would work here, learn my methods, and in time perhaps open your own bakery or inherit this one. I cannot promise wealth, but I can promise meaningful work and a place in this community." Greta stared at him, unable to speak for a moment. "Why would you do this for me? I served the regime that murdered your family." Otto's expression was complicated, mixing pain with something approaching peace. "You did not murder my family. You were a young woman who made choices based on limited information in impossible circumstances. I cannot change what happened to my relatives, but I can choose how to respond to what is happening now. If I allow hatred to guide me, then Hitler wins even in death. Besides," he added with the hint of a smile, "your father's technique for scoring Roggenbrot is better than mine. It would be foolish to let that knowledge disappear." Greta felt tears forming, but forced them back. "If I am allowed to stay, I accept your offer. I will work harder than you can. Imagine, I will honor the trust you are placing in me." The response from Ottawa arrived in late February. Of the 8 women who had requested permission to remain in Canada, 5 were approved for landed immigrant status contingent on securing employment and Canadian sponsors. 3 were denied due to incomplete documentation or concerns about family members still in Germany who might be abandoned. Greta Klein was among those approved. Anna Fisher and Frieda Schultz also received approval. The news created complex emotions throughout the women's camp. Those who were staying felt relief mixed with guilt about abandoning their country. Those who were returning felt abandoned by friends who were choosing to remain with former enemies. The divisions were painful, but ultimately not destructive. Most women understood that each person had to make the choice that allowed them to survive, and survival looked different depending on individual circumstances. Margaret Schmidt, whose request had been denied because of her young son in Germany, made peace with her decision to return. She approached Greta during their final days together. "I do not regret requesting to stay, even though I was denied. The request forced me to honestly examine what I wanted versus what I owed. I will return to my son, and we will rebuild together. But you," she gripped Greta's hand firmly, "you have no such obligation. Build a good life here. Make your father proud by continuing his craft." The final bakery visit happened on March 6th, 1 week before the repatriation transport would depart for Halifax. Otto had prepared a feast. Every type of bread and pastry he knew how to make covered his tables. Roggenbrot, Bauernbrot, pumpernickel, Stollen, Lebkuchen, butter cookies, apple strudel, Black Forest cake. He had worked for 2 days straight to produce this abundance. The women who were staying and those who were leaving gathered together in the small bakery one last time. The atmosphere was bittersweet, filled with embraces and tears and promises to write letters. Otto addressed them all in German, his voice steady but emotional. "You came here as my enemies. You leave as my friends. Some of you will stay and build new lives in this country. Others will return to Germany and face the difficult work of rebuilding there. Both choices require courage. Both choices honor the memory of those we have lost." He raised a cup of coffee and toast. To new beginnings, wherever they may be found. The women who were leaving departed on March 13th. 53 German prisoners boarded trains that would carry them to Halifax, then to ships bound for Europe. They carried letters from Canadian guards, photographs from their time in Wolfville, and small packages of bread from Otto's bakery wrapped carefully to survive the journey. The 5 women who remained, Greta, Anna, Frida, and 2 others named Elizabeth and Katerina, moved into temporary housing arranged by local sponsors while they began their new lives as Canadian immigrants. Greta started work at Muller's Bakery the following Monday, arriving at 3 in the morning just as Otto had done for decades. He taught her his methods, his recipes, his understanding of Canadian flour and water, and how they differed from German ingredients. 25 years later, in 1971, Greta Klein Muller stood in her own bakery on Maple Street in Wolfville, Ontario. The shop bore her name now, having inherited it from Otto, who had passed away peacefully in 1968 at the age of 85. Rachel had followed him 6 months later, her heart simply giving out from grief at losing her companion of 50 years. Greta had married Otto's nephew David Mueller in 1952, taking the family name and ensuring the continuation of the baking tradition. They had 3 children, all of whom had learned to bake before they learned to read. Her eldest daughter, Sarah, named after Otto's daughter, who had moved to Toronto decades earlier, was now the primary baker, arriving at 3 each morning to begin the work her mother had taught her. Greta still came to the bakery every day, but her role had shifted from production to management and customer relations. She greeted regular customers by name, recommended breads for specific occasions, and quietly ensured that the quality standards Otto had established remained uncompromised. The bakery had expanded over the years. What had been Otto's modest storefront now included a larger oven, more workspace, and a small cafe area where customers could sit with coffee and fresh pastries. The menu had evolved too, incorporating Canadian preferences while maintaining traditional German recipes, but the Roggenbrot remained unchanged, still made according to the method Greta's father Joseph had used in his Bavarian bakery decades earlier. That morning, a documentary crew from the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation arrived to film a story about German immigrants who had come to Canada after the war. They had learned Greta's unusual story through church records that documented her transition from prisoner of war to landed immigrant to successful business owner. The interviewer, a young woman named Jennifer Chen, asked Greta to describe the moment she first tasted Otto's bread in 1945. Greta closed her eyes, remembering that November day when she had stood weeping in this very building. "It tasted like home," she said simply, "but not the home I had lost, the home I was going to build." She showed the film crew photographs that hung on the bakery walls, Otto and Rachel standing proudly in front of their original storefront in 1940. The group of German women prisoners on their first bakery visit, faces marked by tears and wonder. Her wedding photo with David, her children as toddlers covered in flour. Otto in his final years, still insisting on baking 1 morning per week despite his age. The documentary would later be titled Bread and Redemption, telling the story of how a Jewish refugee baker and a German prisoner of war found common ground through the simple act of making bread. It would win awards and be shown in schools across Canada as an example of reconciliation and the possibility of transformation. But for Greta, standing in her bakery, surrounded by the smell of rising dough and baking loaves, the real story was simpler. It was about choosing to build rather than to mourn, about finding home not in geography, but in purpose and community and the continuation of traditions that connected past to future, despite all the ruptures history had created between them.